January 17, 1946. The snow outside Wiesbaden fell in long, silent sheets, covering the bombed skeletons of buildings like a burial cloth. The war had ended 8 months ago, yet the city still looked embalmed in grief. Windows shattered, chimneys rising from roofs like ribs of the dead. The camera clicked that morning. A single frame caught the impossible. An American soldier bending to offer a slice of bread to a young German woman in what looked like a wedding dress. Her veil was torn, her fingers trembling, her face thin enough for light to pass through. Historians would later argue whether the photograph was staged. But the hunger in her eyes was too real for fiction. Private James Warren of Kansas didn't remember the camera. He remembered only the way her hand shook when she reached for the bread, and how she pressed it against her chest as if it were gold leaf. He had seen starving people before, villages in France, prisoners near Dachau, but this was different. This woman wasn't pleading. She stood upright, proud even in ruin, her dignity hanging by a thread that war hadn't managed to cut. The streets that day were a mixture of ash and ice. Germans moved like ghosts through their own city, trading watches for potatoes, memories for milk. Official reports from the U.S. Army called this the hunger winter. The temperature had dropped to -20, and in some districts of Frankfurt, people were freezing to death in their sleep. Relief packages were still stuck in bureaucratic warehouses. There were figures cold as the air, 1,000 calories per person per day, if you were lucky. Rations that couldn't keep a child alive. Yet Jimmy, 25 and restless, carried chocolate, cigarettes, and canned peaches in his kit. He'd been assigned to the 97th Infantry Division, part of the American occupation forces, tasked with stabilizing civilian morale. He didn't know how one stabilized hunger or morality. His letters home were full of small jokes that hid fatigue. Kansas feels like a dream, Ma. Here, the wind smells like smoke even when there's no fire. That morning, his patrol moved through the market ruins, searching for black market traders. They found instead a woman fainting in the snow, clutching something white, a torn scrap of satin. Her name, she whispered, was Anna Muller, 22, a seamstress before the war, married for 6 months before her husband was drafted and never returned from the Eastern Front. She still wore her wedding dress because she had nothing else left that fit. Jimmy lifted her gently, the way he might lift a wounded comrade. His breath fogged around her face as he wrapped his scarf around her shoulders. She weighed almost nothing. He asked her something. He didn't know what, just words to fill the silence. But she didn't respond. She was looking past him at the bread in his pack. The kind baked for soldiers, soft, rich, impossible. He tore a piece off and offered it without thought. Later he would write that her first bite sounded louder than the wind. She chewed slowly, reverently, like someone praying. The rest of the patrol watched in silence. None of them said it aloud, but they all felt it. A strange guilt, the kind that settles on the tongue when mercy tastes too much like luxury. When Anna regained her strength, she tried to thank him in broken English. Her voice cracked like porcelain. She said she'd been searching for food for her younger sister, who hadn't eaten in 2 days. Jimmy didn't ask where the sister was. He just handed her another ration and pointed toward the direction of the American relief post. But she didn't move. She stared at his uniform, at the flag stitched above his heart, as though it meant both safety and judgment. That's when the camera clicked again. Someone from the press corps, wandering through ruins in search of post-war hope. The flash startled her. Jimmy blinked at the light, his hand still extended between them, frozen mid-offer. In that moment, 2 worlds, victor and vanquished, met in a silence too complex for orders or forgiveness. The photograph would circulate briefly in army newsletters under the caption, "Compassion in the Ruins." It was meant to be propaganda, a symbol of American generosity. But to those who lived it, it was simply survival dressed in moral confusion. Jimmy didn't think of himself as kind. He thought of himself as tired. Anna, on the other hand, thought she had met a man who looked at her without disgust. Both were wrong. What passed between them that day was neither love nor pity. It was recognition, the humankind that slips through cracks of history like light through broken glass. In the following weeks, their paths crossed again. Wiesbaden was small now, its neighborhoods compressed by rubble. Anna worked cleaning laundry for the base, scrubbing blood from uniforms she didn't dare question. Jimmy saw her one afternoon carrying a bucket across the courtyard, her fingers raw from cold. He called her name softly. She turned, startled, then smiled in the smallest way. He didn't know what to say, so he offered a cigarette. She took it like a truce. The war had left both of them stranded between guilt and longing. He couldn't forget the German faces he'd seen behind enemy rifles. She couldn't forget the roar of American bombers that had leveled her city. Yet in the shadow of that shared past, they found brief reprieve in the mundane bread, smoke, conversation. The narrator's tone here would be calm, reflective. People don't fall in love in such times. They simply find reasons not to disappear. Each evening, the sirens of curfew echoed across the ruins. Jimmy watched from the barracks window as families lit faint candles in basements, silhouettes moving behind walls without roofs. Once, he caught sight of Anna helping her sister, a girl no older than 16, carry water from a broken pipe. The image stayed with him, haunting in its ordinariness. Officially, American soldiers were forbidden to fraternize with German civilians. No contact, the regulations said. But regulations were written for perfect men in perfect wars. The reality was simpler. Everyone was lonely, and loneliness has a way of rewriting orders. One night, during a supply run, Jimmy found himself slipping a loaf of bread into his jacket before leaving the mess hall. It wasn't deliberate. It was instinct. He carried it through the snow, half angry at himself for caring. When he found Anna near the market ruins again, she didn't speak. She just looked at him, then at the bread and laughed softly, the first sound of life he'd heard from her. That laugh changed something. It was fragile, almost absurd in the wasteland around them. Yet it made the silence afterward heavier, meaningful. He realized, standing there under the gray sky, that pity had turned into something else, something dangerous in an occupied land. The camera appeared again days later, same photographer, same curiosity. But this time, Jimmy turned away. He didn't want their faces printed as symbols. He didn't want mercy recorded. Some things, he thought, were sacred only because no one noticed them. Still, history noticed. Years later, archivists would find that photograph mislabeled in a military box. Date smudged, names unlisted. Yet in that frozen frame, the tension of an entire continent lived. A man with too much, a woman with nothing, and a war still unwilling to die. Anna would remember it differently. For her, that morning wasn't history. It was warmth returning to her fingers. It was the smell of bread. It was a stranger who looked at her and didn't see an enemy. By the time spring arrived, the snow melted into thick mud, and ration lines grew longer. Jimmy's unit prepared to withdraw to another sector. He stood once more at the marketplace, waiting, though he didn't know for what. When Anna appeared from the alleys, her sister limping behind, he felt that same unspoken pull, the sense that what they'd shared wasn't finished. He handed her his last ration pack. She took it, eyes wet but smiling faintly. For a moment, the air between them was warmer than the sun. Then a gust of wind lifted her veil, tangling it in the rubble. Jimmy reached to free it, their hands brushing. The sound of a Jeep engine broke the spell. His superior shouted his name. He turned to go, knowing he'd already broken the rules in ways he couldn't explain. As he walked away, she called after him in halting English, the words catching in the cold. "You're the one," she said. "I see in dreams every day." He paused, but didn't look back. Some truths, he thought, are too heavy for the living. Behind him, the ruins shimmered in thin sunlight. The camera clicked once more. And somewhere inside that frame, between ruin and redemption, the story truly began. The winter of 1946 dragged on with the persistence of an old grief. The snow had turned gray from ash and footsteps, and the Rhine's edge froze in silence thick enough to hear one's own pulse. In Wiesbaden, the ruins no longer shocked anyone. They were simply the backdrop of survival. Amidst that landscape of broken walls and broken rules, Private James Warren still found himself searching for the same figure he had once helped from the snow, the girl with the wedding dress and hollow eyes. He told himself it was coincidence when he passed the same street where she laundered soldiers' uniforms, or the canteen where she stood in line for crumbs. But even he knew coincidences had become rare commodities, like sugar or mercy. By February, the American military had decided that kindness was becoming a problem. No fraternization, read the posted orders. All contact with German civilians is prohibited. The rule was clear, but human loneliness was clearer. The soldiers joked about it, called it the no-smiling rule. One private was demoted for giving a woman his gloves. Another spent a night in the stockade for sharing cigarettes. Jimmy laughed along, pretending to agree, but when he passed Anna on the cobblestones, he made sure his rations clinked loudly in his coat pocket. The sound meant hope. Anna had been assigned to wash sheets for the American hospital wing. Her hands were raw from lye and frost, her knuckles constantly split. She worked in silence beside other women who used to be teachers, nurses, daughters of professors. Now they scrubbed, their faces pale as the steam rising around them. When Jimmy found an excuse to bring inspection forms to the laundry tent, she barely looked up, at least not until she saw the bread in his hand. The moment was quiet, almost ritualistic. He placed it on a folded sheet. She stared at it, then at him. Her eyes held more suspicion than gratitude, as if she feared this gesture could be another occupation in disguise. They began to meet in the odd gaps of time, between patrol shifts, between curfews, between reasons. Sometimes they talked. Mostly they didn't. Jimmy's German was pitiful, Anna's English worse, yet somehow they communicated in the pauses. She would gesture to the distant church spire, blackened from bombing, and whisper the word before. He would nod, unable to explain that before was the very word America no longer understood. One evening, as snow drifted through the open rafters of the laundry hall, Jimmy caught her humming. It was a lullaby he didn't know, but the melody carried something like forgiveness. "Pretty," he said. She smiled faintly, not understanding the word but recognizing the tone. That smile haunted him later that night, when his commanding officer lectured the platoon on maintaining distance from enemy nationals. The speech was full of righteous certainty, as if discipline could rebuild Europe faster than compassion. Still, Jimmy knew danger when he saw it. One afternoon, a military policeman spotted him passing Anna a paper-wrapped loaf. The officer's expression was enough. A warning, quiet but deadly. Jimmy spent the next 3 days expecting a reprimand that never came. The silence was worse than punishment. It meant they were being watched. Outside, rumors were spreading faster than relief. German women seen with Americans were being called Ami girls or worse. Locals spat near their feet, while soldiers whispered about them in barracks slang. But hunger blurred judgment, and affection was the only currency that still held value. Officially, by the summer of 1946, over 20,000 relationships between GIs and German women had been documented. Unofficially, no one could count how many survived beyond secrecy. Anna's sister, Greta, had grown ill by then. Malnutrition, the doctor said, though no one needed a diagnosis to know that food was life itself. Jimmy smuggled cans of condensed milk and aspirin from the base kitchen. Each time he did, he risked court-martial. Each time, he told himself it didn't matter. War had already stolen the right to moral certainty. One night, Anna stopped him before he left their usual meeting place, the bombed church where pigeons nested in the altar. She reached into her coat and pulled out a ribbon. It was frayed, the color faded beyond name. She placed it in his hand and said, "Gluck." He didn't know the word, but the warmth in her eyes told him it meant something like hope, or maybe just for luck. He carried it in his pocket from then on, as if the thin thread could protect him from both the army and himself. The world around them was shifting. News spread that General Lucius Clay, the military governor, was pushing for reconstruction and reform. The Marshall Plan had begun to stir in speeches, though the people in ruins hadn't yet tasted its promise. For now, survival meant trade. Cigarettes bought potatoes. Nylon stockings bought forgiveness. And somewhere in the middle of it all, two human beings kept meeting, one rule at a time. They had begun to talk about leaving Wiesbaden, half fantasy, half confession. Jimmy wanted to take her somewhere the war hadn't reached, maybe Kansas, where wheat stretched farther than guilt. Anna only smiled at that idea. Too wide, she said, making a sweeping gesture with her arms. People lost in so much sky. He laughed, surprised at her humor. In that instant, he saw not the starving woman of January, but a living spark, a survivor reclaiming her right to jest. But the line between tenderness and treason grew thinner each day. Soldiers caught in relationships faced reassignment, loss of pay, or deportation of their partners. The chaplain called such liaisons moral infection. Yet even he traded soap for eggs at the black market. The hypocrisy stung like frostbite, and Jimmy learned to hide his defiance under silence. One dusk, as he walked Anna home through the cracked streets, an old man spat at them and muttered shame. She didn't flinch. She simply took Jimmy's arm, her fingers cold but steady. For the first time, he realized she wasn't the one being rescued anymore. They were rescuing each other, in different ways neither could name. At the barracks that night, a corporal teased him. "You found yourself a Fräulein, didn't ya?" Jimmy said nothing, but his blush betrayed him. Laughter followed, rough and harmless, until someone added, "Careful, or they'll ship her off to the camps again." The room went quiet. Even jokes had limits when spoken over ghosts. Days turned into weeks. Spring brought mud, then lilacs, then rumors of troop withdrawal. Jimmy's heart twisted at the thought. He began to count moments instead of days. The way her hair caught the morning light, the faint scent of soap she couldn't afford. She began to speak his name differently, softly, like it meant belonging. Still, every kindness was shadowed by fear. Letters from the U.S. warned soldiers not to compromise national integrity. The irony was sharp. The same nation preaching democracy now feared the democracy of love. Jimmy read the memo, folded it neatly, and used it to wrap the bread he gave her that evening. She laughed when she realized it, a laugh so pure that for a second the war lifted from their shoulders. But peace has a way of testing those who dare to believe in it. That summer, the military police began new patrols, checking identification and enforcing curfews. Anna's work permit was suddenly revoked. Reorganization, they said. To her, it meant starvation again. To Jimmy, it meant rebellion. He walked her home that night beneath a bruised sunset, the air heavy with rain. She stopped at the church gate, pressed his ribbon back into his palm, and whispered, "Next week, you go." He nodded, unable to find words. Then she added, almost teasingly, "Don't forget bread." He smiled, not realizing how final those words would sound years later. How in the ruins of one forbidden affection, history was already choosing which stories to remember, and which to bury in silence. February bled into March with a deceptive calm, the kind that settles over occupied cities before rules tighten. The snow had melted into mud, and the streets of Wiesbaden stank of damp stone and boiled cabbage. Soldiers marched with a tired rhythm now, no longer heroes, just custodians of order. But among them, Private James Warren walked differently. Each patrol carried a quiet defiance tucked beneath his uniform, the promise of bread. He had become careful. The loaf wrapped inside his coat no longer rustled. The cigarettes he smuggled were hidden in his boot. The military police had begun inspecting barracks, confiscating personal caches, reporting fraternization incidents. The word carried the same weight as betrayal. Jimmy knew this, yet every time he saw Anna waiting near the church ruins, her scarf gray with soot, something inside him softened. In a world rebuilt on punishment, she was his only act of forgiveness. They met at dusk, when the city blurred into silhouettes and smoke. The church had no roof, only ribs of stone reaching toward the cold sky. Beneath that broken altar, they shared contraband meals. A crust of bread, a tin of jam, sometimes nothing but silence. She ate slowly, as if tasting not food but memory. He watched her hands, once red from labor, now trembling less. "Better," he said once. She nodded, smiling shyly, and replied in halting English, "You good man." He wanted to laugh, to tell her she was wrong, that he was a coward who couldn't even write her name in his letters home. But he only said, "Eat." Rumors had begun to spread within the division. A sergeant claimed to have seen Warren's ghost girl. Another said he was paying off locals with rations. The tone wasn't cruel, just curious, the gossip of men too long kept from women and decency. But curiosity had consequences. One morning, a memo arrived from headquarters signed by General Clay himself. Unlawful fraternization is compromising discipline. Effective immediately, offenders will be reassigned or court-martialed. Jimmy read it twice. The paper smelled of ink and power, both foreign to him. That evening, he found Anna waiting with her sister outside an abandoned bakery. Greta was pale, coughing hard enough to draw blood. Anna explained through gestures and broken words that the hospital had refused her. "For Germans only," she said bitterly. Jimmy knelt beside the girl, unwrapping a can of milk. "Drink slow," he murmured. Greta looked up at him with glassy gratitude. For a moment, he felt like the world had purpose again. When he returned to base, his commanding officer, Captain Riley, was waiting. "You've been seen in the ruins," he said. "No anger, no shouting, just weariness. She's not your responsibility, son. You feed one, 10 more will follow. The army isn't here to play savior." Jimmy stood at attention, jaw tight. "Yes, sir." Riley sighed. "Kansas, isn't it? You look like Kansas. Go back home clean, not tangled in someone else's hunger." But home no longer meant what it used to. The telegrams from Kansas spoke of new tractors, spring rain, and baseball season starting again. None of it reached him anymore. His world had narrowed to one fragile woman who made starvation look like faith. 2 nights later, the military police raided a ration warehouse. Jimmy wasn't caught, but others were, and every man was interrogated. The air in the barracks turned colder, suspicion dripping through the ranks. Still, he couldn't stop. Each forbidden loaf felt heavier in his hands, not from guilt but from meaning. The bread had become a language neither of them could speak, but both understood. "I see you. I won't let you vanish." When Anna's sister died in late March, the city bells didn't ring. They hadn't rung in years. Jimmy helped her bury the girl at dawn, in frozen ground behind the church. Anna didn't cry. She just knelt and pressed her palms into the soil, whispering something he couldn't catch. He wanted to comfort her, but there were no words clean enough for grief. So he tore the last of his bread in half and placed it beside the grave. "For her," he said softly. Anna looked up then, her eyes rimmed with red but steady. "For us," she corrected. From that day their bond changed shape. It was no longer pity disguised as kindness. It was something fiercer, almost dangerous. When he held her hand, it wasn't to console. It was to anchor himself in the one truth left after war, that even the forbidden could be sacred. Yet the world refused to let them keep it. A photograph appeared in the Stars and Stripes newsletter. A grainy image of Jimmy and Anna outside the bakery, her scarf trailing, his hand outstretched. "Humanity amidst the ruins," the caption read. He stared at it in disbelief. Someone had followed them. The photo was proof, and proof was peril. The summons came the next day. "Report to headquarters," said the clerk. He spent the night pacing his barracks. The ribbon Anna had given him clenched in his fist. He thought of destroying it, then couldn't. In the morning, he slipped it into his breast pocket, close to the place where the flag patch lay. At the office, the major behind the desk didn't look cruel, only tired. "Private Warren," he said, "you're being reassigned to Nuremberg. You'll leave in 3 days." The tone was final. Jimmy's throat tightened. "Sir, there's someone here who depends on me." The major's eyes flicked up. "You've already done enough for her. More than the law allows." When he stepped outside, the sky was a dull silver, threatening rain. Anna was waiting near the gates, as if she had known. He told her in broken German, "I must go." She blinked, understanding too well. "You come back." He wanted to promise, but lies had ruined enough of her life. "I'll try," he said. She smiled faintly, brushing her fingers against his cheek. Then I wait. That night they met one last time in the church. The air smelled of wet stone and candle wax. Anna had brought something wrapped in cloth, her wedding veil, the same one she'd worn the day he first found her. "No white now," she said softly, unfolding it. "Gray only." He laughed once, brokenly, and whispered, "Still beautiful." They stood there, the candle trembling between them. Then, quietly, they spoke vows neither church nor army would recognize. No priest, no witness, only ruin as altar and silence as blessing. He took her hands, kissed her forehead, and said, "When they ask why, tell them, it was for bread." She nodded, tears catching the candlelight. "Bread?" she repeated, voice steady. "And love." They parted before dawn. He left behind his coat, his rations, and the ribbon she'd once given him, tied around her wrist now like a promise. When the trucks rolled out that morning, Wiesbaden blurred into mist. He didn't look back. Weeks later, that photograph resurfaced in an American magazine, lauded as a symbol of reconciliation. Strangers admired the nameless pair who embodied post-war mercy. They never knew the soldier had been punished for it. They never knew the woman had waited by the church each evening until summer came. History would call it propaganda. But for the two souls caught between hunger and hope, it had been something else entirely. Something that neither war nor time could ration away. And far from the ruins, in a barracks near Nuremberg, a young man stared at an empty tin of bread rations and whispered to no one, "She's still hungry." The year was 1952, and America had already traded its war memories for new ones. Television screens, motor cars, and the smell of fresh coffee in diners untouched by ash. In Kansas, on a windy morning in late spring, a woman stepped off a train clutching a small suitcase and a worn photograph. The image showed a soldier offering bread to a starving bride in a ruined city. Time had yellowed its edges, but her eyes, those defiant, searching eyes, were still unmistakable. Her name now was Anna Warren. She had crossed an ocean to reach the promise that began in rubble. 6 years of paperwork, interrogations, and denials had nearly broken her. Each rejection from the American consulate came with the same phrase, "Entry deferred pending review." Yet she refused to vanish back into history. When the War Brides Act passed, she applied once more, using the only proof of love she had, a letter Jimmy had smuggled from Nuremberg before being discharged. It was short, unpoetic, but sacred. "If I can't bring you bread again, I'll bring you home." Jimmy had waited in Kansas the way soldiers wait for dawn, half believing it will come, half fearing it won't. He worked his father's wheat fields by day and built a small bakery by night, kneading dough like penance. The townsfolk knew him as the quiet veteran with kind eyes and a scar above his collar, but no one knew why he never married. When word finally came that his petition had been approved, he stood still for a long time, the telegram trembling in his hands as if the world itself might change its mind. At the train station, when he saw her step down, thinner, older, but alive, the years between them collapsed. She wore a plain gray dress, her wedding veil folded neatly in her suitcase. He approached without words, the Kansas wind whipping his hat aside. For a moment, they simply stared, two survivors measuring what war had taken and what mercy had returned. Then he said quietly, "You found me." She smiled, the same small smile she'd given in the ruins. "You promised bread." Life in America was kinder but strange to her. The abundance frightened her at first, the overflowing stores, the laughter of children with sticky hands. "Too much bread," she told him once, standing in their small bakery as customers filled the air with chatter. "Too much good." He laughed softly, brushing flour from her hair. "You'll get used to it." Yet part of her never did. She still saved every crust, every crumb, as if famine might sneak back in the night. They never spoke much about Germany. The ghosts were quieter that way. But sometimes, when rain hit the tin roof just right, she would rest her head on his shoulder and whisper. Greta would have liked this sound. He would answer, "Then she's here too." There was nothing dramatic about their happiness. It was built from routine, from small mercies and the steady hum of forgiveness. Still, even peace has its storms. In 1953, a journalist found them through the old photograph. He wanted to write about the soldier and the bride who defied the rules. Jimmy hesitated, but Anna agreed. "If they tell it right," she said, "maybe someone else won't be afraid to love." The article ran with a new caption, "Bread and Freedom." Letters poured in from across the country. Veterans, widows, strangers thanking them for reminding the world that kindness had survived the ashes. But fame, like war, leaves marks. One evening, they stood in the bakery doorway as the sun dipped behind the fields. Anna looked at the horizon and said, "They think it's a love story." He nodded slowly. "It was survival first. Love came after." She smiled at that, a tired, knowing smile. "Then it's still both." The years softened them but never dulled their bond. He grew gray around the temples. She developed a limp from the winters she'd endured. Yet every morning, before opening the bakery, she would place a single loaf on the counter and say, "For him." And every evening, before closing, he would wrap one for her with the same care he once hid it under his coat. When Jimmy passed in 1970, the town attended his funeral. On his coffin lay that old photograph, edges worn, faces blurred. Anna lived quietly for 3 more years, still tending the bakery until her hands failed her. On the day she died, a neighbor found a note taped to the oven door in her careful, uneven handwriting. "He gave me bread when the world gave me none. That is love enough for a lifetime." The bakery still stands today, its sign faded by wind. The locals call it the Promise Bakery. Inside, framed behind the counter, hangs that photograph, an American soldier, a German bride, and the moment where mercy chose to survive the war.